We're going to talk a little bit about what we're doing within the Microsoft Azure tenant for securing our containers. So we'll talk a little bit about where we are, what we're trying to accomplish, and what we're doing today. So when we started approaching this, our goal was we wanted to be able to, get some security around our containers inside Azure. Of course, Microsoft, we're almost entirely in the cloud today. So our services are being built on cloud services. And so containers are becoming a big part of that as well. So we wanted to make sure we integrated our security so that when people were deploying, they had security built in as much as possible so that our developers and our users aren't having to think about security as a part of their build process as much. We want it to just be there and be ongoing so that they can focus on writing good code and good applications for our customer base. So we're really focused on having that security baked in as much as possible. So that was one of the goals we have as we're moving forward with our container security. But with the same time, we want to make sure that impact is low. We don't want to make it a complicated process for that security to be there. We want to make sure that our developers are continuing to roll code and the security is something that they don't have to build in, and it doesn't create hurdles for them getting their code deployed out there. So as we started looking at what we had out there and what this security landscape was going to look like, we had to start pulling numbers. And so today we've got within the Microsoft Azure tenant, we have about roughly 45,000 registries deployed in Azure. We've also got a little over 13,000 Azure Service Fabrics, which is Microsoft's, which is the Azure's native container solution. And then we've got roughly 15,000 Kubernetes services, and then 21,000 containers. Of course, those container instances, that number can fluctuate pretty significantly, but when the numbers were pooled, that was roughly what was out there. And so we've got a large container environment out there, which obviously represents a huge potential security attack vector. So getting some security wrapped around that is, as you can imagine, is paramount for the company, because that's a lot of exposed services potentially out there that we want to make sure that we're not creating breach points into our environment. So the challenges with this was, as we started doing this, one of the things we found is that our developers were already using containers. They had started using containers much more aggressively than we had realized. Of course, Microsoft is a large organization, 160,000 employees, as last I knew. So there's a lot of people out there that could potentially be building and deploying these containers, and there's a lot more of excitement within the company than we realized. So so trying to get out there and build a solution for this large scale has been challenging and has a lot of challenges. So, one of the things we have to do is there were a lot of pre-existing deployments when we started looking at this and trying to understand what that looked like, was kind of challenging. Actually, I see Luciano just joined. So Luciano, we're just getting into the challenges portion. If you'd like to, you can jump in here, or I can continue. I think you're muted. There we go.
There you go. Continue, please.
Okay.
I'll catch up later.
Yep, no problem. So one of the things we saw is people were embracing this is there's exponential growth. I mean, the growth rate of container deployments, Kubernetes deployments, registry deployments in the environment has been quite impressive, to be honest. So people are really embracing it inside the company, and so the growth has been huge. And so that's a challenge that we're now dealing with, is that growth rate and how to stay in front of that and manage that. Ensuring all the container deployments are covered at creation, right? Just doing what we can to actually, rather than secure these things or audit them after they're deployed, trying to get something in front of them so that when they're deployed to begin with, they're secure. So, you know, because retrofitting is a lot harder than secure by default. So getting that security baked in was a challenge that we wanted to address. And so we've got some things there that we feel like are really helping us with that. We'll talk about those a little bit more in a minute. And then the other thing is we're just always being able to know what's there, because especially since it's a very dynamic environment with the fact that it's cloud and people can spin things up and tear them down very quickly. It can be challenging trying to stay abreast of what is in your environment so that you can have some level of assurance that you are securing everything, especially at the scale that, you know, we're talking about here. And part of that too is just, you know, there's because a lot of things get spun up, a lot of things get torn down. Sometimes things don't get torn down when they get spun up. So trying to keep a preview on what is existing out there that's not being used, because one of the challenges with unused code is that it's not getting updated. So even though we may have security scans and we may have some idea of the security vulnerabilities there, and we can alert on new vulnerabilities that are discovered, if someone's not maintaining those real well, it can be challenging to make sure that we're plugging all those holes. So the cleanup of unused repositories, unused images is also a challenge that we wanted to address. And then patching, how we do patching and versioning. And so of course with containers, it's a little bit different than the traditional server or VM that many people are used to, and especially a lot of people on the operations side are used to. So one of the things that we're really starting to do is encourage people to use what's called latest tag in their deployments. So whenever you're deploying your Kubernetes or your Docker solutions, and rather than specifying a specific build, we're recommending using latest tag. So that way when repositories get updated, those images automatically get updated. So the Kubernetes system starts picking those up, so that you're not having to go back through and touch each of your deployments to actually push the updates. You're just dropping those into the repositories and allowing the system to do that update for you. So we'll talk a little bit about where we're starting with security, right? So today we've got a team that's basically doing code audit. So basically what they're doing is, as people are building their stuff through Azure DevOps or CI/CD, or even if they're picking up images directly from the marketplace, what we've got teams that are now taking a look at those codes before they go production and doing audits of those codes to look for things like, look for malware and vulnerability and things like that. So a lot of times what they're doing is they're pushing the devs so they're looking at all the code that's in there and looking at the snippets and the open sources, the codes that they're using, so that they can go through and help the developer verify that there's no vulnerabilities. They're not using vulnerable versions of the code, so that we can get those out there. And there's also some licensing aspects and things like that are done for more legal purposes. But they're doing those audits and they're doing those scans against pre-release code, so that when the code gets released, at least there's a certain level of security. It's kind of a minimum security bar that's been met before that gets rolled out. And CI/CD, which is all a part of the Azure DevOps, they're auditing those as well, so that those workflows run, those things can be audited as they're getting released into development before they get released in production as well. The other thing that is done is for all the marketplace images that we release in the Azure Marketplace, those images are being scanned as well, so that there's a certain level of assurance that they're meeting a minimum bar in terms of vulnerability, malware, and secrets and secrets and codes and things like that. So those images are being scanned prior to going to the marketplace, so that there's a certain level of security fidelity built in. And of course, a lot of people within Microsoft will use those marketplace images, but not all the images are used for marketplace. So there are some custom built, but where possible, people will use the marketplace one. So at least that gives us a certain level of security baked in when they first roll out. So staying secure. And this is an area we've been focusing on a lot right now. This is where Luciano and I and the team we work on is spending a lot of our efforts, is how do we keep these things secure once they're deployed. So what we're doing is we're using third-party tool today that does certain scannings and repository scannings. So what we're doing is we're scanning all the repositories across the environment. We'll be doing all of them across the environment. We started within our larger org for now, and we're rolling it out to the larger company. But we're scanning for vulnerabilities and malware, sequencing code, and super users. One of the challenges that we spoke about earlier is knowing your inventory, and this is where inventory becomes very important, because with these scanners, you have to be able to point your repositories to the scanners, and so it's a little bit more of a push model than a pull model, a discover model. So we need those. So we have to go out and discover that inventory so we can make sure that they are pointed in. So that way we have to go in, and that way we can go in and call them in and bring them into the system to make sure we're scanning them and make sure we're getting those images. Because obviously, vulnerability malware is a little bit different in a container world, but it's still a threat. And we've seen some. There's, if you start to look online, you can do some searches and you can find that there's been some interesting vulnerabilities out there. There's been Bitcoin code inserted into some of these images, Bitcoin mining code. So people are, as they deploy containers, they're mining Bitcoin for some other company, right? And so there's been, and there's obviously malware, because this is code, right? So there's backdoors and things that can get released into code. So having those updates, and then managing the secrets in code, which can be a huge problem. Developers can sometimes be a little, they like to have control over everything. So sometimes they put everything in their code together, and that creates some risks. And there's also a lot of common practice where people use super user for their deployment. So being able to monitor for all those things, be able to actually scan for all the things is those are kind of the key areas that we see as huge risks and where we're focusing our scanning. And the other thing we're rolling out now is runtime scanning. So we're actually scanning the runtime code so that if it gets altered or modified, then we have some knowledge that we can actually flag or alert if something is injected into running code. So if some kind of malware gets injected in, or someone tampers with the code, then we can actually start to monitor that. So now, of course, one of the challenges with all that is once you have it up and running is that compliance reporting and compliance enforcement. So at Microsoft, we've got a lot of tools internally, and sometimes it's challenging managing those compliances. So we're trying to take all that compliance data and bring it into our existing system. So today, it's a separate dashboard that has that compliance, and we're trying to bring it all together to give our users a single pane for security, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about our future state and how that plays out in Azure here in a minute. But just being able to have that risks point in front of the customer, so the customers can see where they're lacking, where their security is potentially breached, and also calling them out on it is important, right? So scanning and knowing you're vulnerable does no good if you're not enforcing it. So that's so as we start looking at next step. So we've been working on this process for a while of getting this third-party solution deployed and validating and testing it. We're still just now getting our runtime scanning up and running, but this is a third-party solution. So some of the things we're looking at, investing in the future, are some of the new things that that Azure is baking into the product. We've got Azure policies, and we're looking at how we're going to use Azure policies to do a little bit more security by default. The nice thing about Azure Security is that you can build your policies so that when someone deploys something, if it doesn't meet the requirements, it blocks it, so they never even deploy insecure code. So we'll be looking at how we're going to use Azure Policy to set baseline configurations for containers so that we can enforce new deployments to meet that bar. And then we can also use that for alerting on existing. So things that exist today, brownfield information, brownfield containers and deployments, we can actually use Azure Policy to kind of do an audit of those and be able to do reporting and compliance on those as well. The other thing that we're looking at is Azure Security Center, which is a fast changing space. Excuse me just a moment. Right there. So Azure Security Center has is a product that's growing very quickly, and so we're looking at how we can start to use Azure Security Center to do more of the Kubernetes Docker security components, how we can start to use that to do scanning and things like that. So we're looking at the tool sets they built there. We're working with the product team to give them feedback on how they can potentially build new features in that might help scale up with the containers. Containers is becoming a big business within the cloud space. And so Microsoft, the Azure team within Microsoft, is investing heavily in containers. So we're starting to partner with them on some of that to help provide them some operational inputs into what does and doesn't work well for customers, and how we can make the product more viable for customers. So we'll be spending more time in the coming months with Azure Security Center and how we can leverage that. The other thing that we'll be looking at, we haven't gotten to yet, this is there's a recent blog about this just last month. So Microsoft is starting to work with some providers around container service operators. So they've partnered with a number, I think it's about 10 or 11 so far, open source service operators, so that we can start to take some of these open source tools and integrate them into Azure, so that you can start to have like kind of a command center for managing these different open source service providers, service operators, so that you can start to get a deeper look into your environment, your containers, and start to treat them like resources within Azure, so that you can start to manage them. I'm not sure how heavily the callers on here are using Azure today, but in Azure, everything is resource based, so it's all about resources. And so as they start to integrate these operators in as if they were resources, then they can start to we start to do your coding and scripting there, and so you have a single place to kind of manage all those different container operators. And then the next thing that we'll be looking at is Azure Arc. Azure Arc is enabling Kubernetes clustering, and so Arc is kind of a larger scale management plane. It's kind of even cross cloud. It can kind of allow you to manage things at much larger scale. So we're going to start looking at how we can integrate Arc into our environment, and how we can start to use that as they start to enable like clustering features. And so that's kind of the road ahead, and that's kind of where we are today. So Luciano, is there anything you'd like to add? Anything you feel like I missed?
Regarding the images, you said very well that one of the problems is the images that are persistent and they are not recycled. Another solution that the people can do is to build in update software for it, or update scripts like you would do in a regular Linux or Windows environment. But unless those are not on the image already built in, we cannot ensure that that image will be updated in the future. So it is recommended to just use containers as a temporary resource, and then spin a new one when you need, and keep your images updated through CI/CD, and also make sure that the upstream providers of your images are also compliant.
So yeah, so it's been quite a journey going through this. The scale of containers is becoming quite impressive. So I mean, I don't know what state your various organizations are in. If you haven't taken a look at your container landscape and what's being deployed, especially if you're offering cloud solutions to your user base, your developer base, it might be nice to go take a look, and you might be surprised. We were very surprised at just how large the scale had gotten to be. So it's something that definitely, if you haven't been looking at or thinking about, probably something that you should do much sooner than later.
Yeah. Also, the variety of containers and applications that live on that space is quite large, and there is so much, I guess, diversity on code in there that it must be looked at, especially
Right.
if you have offerings like a marketplace.